Before the sun even kissed the frost-covered fields, someone's bare feet were already on the move across mud, stones, and frozen ground to fetch water. Not for glory, not for comfort, just to survive another day. Tonight, we follow the quiet struggle of forgotten dawns when a simple bucket could weigh heavier than hope. If stories of silent strength soothe your sleep, hit subscribe and tap the bell. Dust, tell us in the comments, could you have fetched water before sunrise? Every single day. The first pale threads of dawn had barely begun to stretch across the Mesopotamian sky when Anelbani heard the familiar creak of wooden wheels against packed earth. From his modest home near the irrigation canal, the sound meant only one thing. The water distributors were making their rounds, and soon the intricate dance of survival that had governed his people for over 1,000 years would begin anew. You might imagine this was a simple matter of walking to a well or turning a tap. But in the city-state of Babylon around 1750 BCE, water was not merely a necessity, was the foundation of law, the source of conflict, and the measure of a civilization's sophistication. Enlil-Bani, whose name honored the ancient Sumerian god of air and storms, was what we might call a water administrator in Babylon. His daily routine began not when the sun rose, but when the stars still held dominion over the sky. At what you would recognize as approximately 4:30 in the morning, he would rise from his reed mat, splash his face with water from a carefully rationed clay vessel, and begin the methodical process of dressing in the darkness. The rough-woven wool of his tunic, dyed brown with local clay, would scratch against skin already weathered by years of exposure to sun and wind. His feet, hardened by a lifetime of walking on stone and mud, would slide into leather sandals that bore the patina of countless journeys along the canal networks that veined the city. Like arteries, but Enlil-Bani's morning ritual was far from unique. Throughout the sprawling settlement that housed nearly 200,000 souls, similar scenes played out in the pre-dawn darkness. The water carriers, mostly women and children, would emerge from their homes carrying large earthenware jars called hubber, vessels that could hold up to 4 gallons of precious liquid. These jars, painstakingly crafted by skilled potters and reinforced with organic fibers to prevent cracking, represented a significant investment for most families. A single hover might cost the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a common laborer, making their care and maintenance a matter of economic survival. The complexity of Babylon's would have impressed even modern engineers. The city drew its lifeblood from an elaborate network of canals that diverted water from the mighty Euphrates River, channeling it through a series of locks, dams, and distribution points that required constant maintenance and supervision. The main canal, nearly 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep, could carry enough water to supply the entire city during the flood season. But during the dry months, particularly the brutal summer period that modern Iraqis still call Cade, every drop became a negotiated commodity governed by laws that had been carved in stone and enforced with the full weight of royal authority. It was these laws, codified in the famous Code of Hammurabi, that gave Enlil-Bani his authority and shaped every aspect of his morning routine. If anyone be too lazy to keep his dam in proper condition, and does not so keep it, if then the dam break and all the fields be flooded, then shall he in whose dam the break occurred be sold for money, and the money shall replace the corn which he has caused to be ruined. This was not merely an abstract legal principle, was a death sentence disguised as civil code. And everyone in the water trade knew it. As Enlil-Bani made his way through the narrow streets toward the central distribution point, he carried with him a collection of clay tablets that recorded the previous day's water allocations. Each tablet, roughly the size of your palm and inscribed with cuneiform characters, represented hours of meticulous accounting. The weight of these records in his leather satchel was modest at perhaps 5 pounds in total, but their importance to the city's survival was immeasurable. A single error in transcription could lead to a family going without water for washing, a craftsman unable to mix his clay, or a baker forced to close his shop for lack of the liquid needed to make bread. The streets of Babylon in the pre-dawn hours held a particular quality that you might find both alien and familiar. The narrow passageways between mud brick buildings created acoustic channels that amplified every sound, the soft slap of sandaled feet against packed earth, the quiet conversations between neighbors greeting each other in the darkness, the distant lowing of cattle being led to water troughs near the city's edge. But perhaps most distinctive was the sound of water itself, the gentle gurgle of liquid flowing through carefully constructed channels, the rhythmic splash of someone drawing from a public cistern, the careful glug-glug-glug of precious fluid. Being poured from one container to another, the air carried the mingled sense of a civilization, built around water management. The sweet, earthy smell of irrigation-fed gardens mixed with a slightly metallic odor of canal water, the organic richness of wet mud, and the faint alkaline temps that came from limestone-filtered groundwater. These were not merely atmospheric details, they were the sensory markers that told every resident whether the water system was functioning properly. An experienced Babylonian could smell impending drought in the subtle changes to canal odor, just as they could detect the approach of flood season in the shifting chemistry of the air. But as Enlil-Bene approached the main distribution center, located in the shadow of the great ziggurat that dominated Babylon's skyline, he was confronted with a sight that filled him with professional dread. A crowd had already gathered around the primary water allocation point, and the tone of their voices suggested something far more serious than the usual morning negotiations over water rights. The crowd included not just the typical early morning water collectors, but also several figures whose presence at dawn could only mean trouble. Representatives from the temple hierarchy, wealthy merchants who normally sent servants to handle such mundane tasks, and most ominously, a pair of royal officials whose bronze badges of office glinted dully in the flickering light of oil lamps. The source of the commotion became clear as Enlil-Bene pushed through the gathered crowd. Someone had opened the main distribution gate. During the night opened it, without authorization, and allowed thousands of gallons of precious water to flow unchecked into the lower city districts. The theft represented not just a loss of water, but a violation of the most fundamental principles that held their society together. Under Hammurabi's law, water theft was punishable by death, but the practical implications went far beyond legal sanctions. If water could be stolen with impunity, if the carefully maintained balance between supply and demand could be disrupted by individual greed, then the entire foundation of their civilization was at risk. As the crowd grew larger and more agitated, Enlil-Bene found himself facing the kind of moment that would define not just his day, but potentially his entire future. The stolen water had come from his assigned section of the canal system. The responsibility, under law, was his. The tablets in his satchel, so carefully maintained, had become evidence that could either prove his innocence or seal his fate. And somewhere in the growing crowd, the actual thief might be standing, listening, waiting to see whether blame would fall on the administrator or whether suspicion would turn in other directions. The sun had not yet risen, but already the day had taken on the weight of life and death consequence. The question that would drive everything that followed was simple in its complexity. In a world where water meant survival, who could be trusted to guard the guardians? The interrogation began before full sunrise, conducted in the shadow of the great ziggurat by officials, whose very presence suggested that this water theft had implications far beyond a simple administrative oversight. Enlil-Bene found himself seated on a low stone bench, his carefully maintained tablets spread before him like evidence at a trial, while three men examined his records with the methodical precision of those whose conclusions would determine whether he lived or died. The lead investigator, A man named Marduk Nazar, whose title translated roughly to Royal Inspector of Water Rights, had the unsettling habit of reading each cuneiform character aloud as he traced it with his finger, turning in Lilbani's daily routine into something that sounded almost incriminating. Third day of the month of Abu Marduk Nazar intoned, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. Water allocation to the household of Nabiramani. 4 calm measures for domestic use. 2 calm measures for workshop operations. Inspector notation. Allocation completed before noon bell. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes holding the kind of calculating intelligence that made Lilbani acutely aware of how much his life had suddenly come to depend on the accuracy of marks he had made in clay weeks earlier. Yet yesterday, this same household received 6 additional calm measures after sunset, from whose authority the mathematics of survival in ancient Babylon were precise and unforgiving. A calm measure equaled approximately 1 liter of water, enough for one person's drinking and basic washing needs for a single day. The standard household allocation, carefully calculated based on family size, occupation, and social status, represented the difference between survival and slow death by dehydration. But the allocation Marduk Nazar had identified represented something far more troubling. It suggested that someone with access to the distribution system had been quietly redistributing water outside the legal framework that held their society. Together, as the investigation continued, Lilbani began to understand that the water theft he had discovered was merely the visible edge of something much larger and more dangerous. The crowd that had gathered at dawn included not just concerned citizens, but also representatives from 3 separate merchant families who had been quietly competing for water rights to support expanding ceramic workshops. The ceramic trade essential for creating the storage vessels, building materials, and decorative items that sustained Babylon's economy required enormous quantities of water for clay preparation, shaping, and firing processes. A single large pottery workshop might consume as much water in a day as 20 ordinary families, making access to reliable water supplies a matter of economic life and death. The investigation revealed a web of relationships and obligations that exemplified the complexity of water management in the ancient world. The merchant Nabiramani, whose household had received the suspicious additional allocation, was not simply a wealthy trader seeking personal advantage. He was the primary supplier of storage vessels to the royal granary system, making his workshops continued operation a matter of strategic importance to the kingdom's food security. His workers, skilled artisans whose expertise had taken decades to develop, represented an irreplaceable economic resource. If his workshop failed due to water shortages, the ripple effects would extend far beyond his immediate family to affect food distribution, military preparedness, and the kingdom's ability to trade with neighboring civilizations. But the complexity of the situation extended even further. The water that had been stolen had not simply disappeared. It had been redirected to support the construction of new defensive walls around the city's eastern quarter. The construction project, ordered by Hammurabi himself as protection against increasing raids by nomadic tribes, required enormous quantities of water for mixing mud mortars, maintaining work crews, and supporting the hundreds of laborers who had been conscripted from surrounding villages. The official in charge of the construction project, a man named Simmubalit, whose authority derived directly from the royal court, had apparently been quietly supplementing his water allocation by negotiating private arrangements with local distributors. The legal implications were staggering. Unauthorized interference with water distribution carried penalties ranging from financial compensation to slavery or death, depending on the scale of the violation and its consequences. But the law also recognized the principle of necessity. Actions taken to preserve the kingdom's security could potentially justify violations of standard procedure. The question facing the investigators was whether Sinmubalit's unauthorized water Requisitions constituted criminal theft or necessary military preparation, as the morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the investigation scene. Enlobani found himself caught between competing loyalties and legal obligations. His job required him to enforce water distribution laws with absolute precision. But his position also made him privy to information about military preparations that he was forbidden to discuss with civilian investigators. The tablets in his possession contained not just routine allocation records, but also coded notations that indicated the true destination of various water diversions. If he revealed this information, he might save himself from criminal charges but betray military secrets. If he remained silent, he might preserve operational security but face execution as a water thief. The investigation process itself revealed the sophisticated administrative systems that made Babylon's water management possible. Each water distribution point was monitored by multiple officials whose overlapping responsibilities created a system of checks and balances, designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized allocation that had brought them all together that morning. The distribution gates themselves were secured with bronze locks that required 3 separate keys, held by different officials, to open. The measuring vessels used to determine allocations were certified by temple authorities and marked with official seals. Even the timing of water distribution was regulated. Specific hours were designated for different types of users, from domestic households to commercial workshops to religious institutions. Yet, despite these elaborate safeguards, the system remained vulnerable to the kind of quiet corruption that Enlil-Bani was now suspected of facilitating. A distributor who knew the schedules and procedures could redirect significant quantities of water simply by opening gates at unauthorized times, or by manipulating the measuring process to provide extra allocations to preferred customers. Profits from such arrangements could be substantial. Water, in times of scarcity, could command prices equivalent to grain or silver. But the risks were equally substantial, as Enlil-Bani was discovering. The social implications of water theft extended far beyond the immediate legal consequences. In a society where survival depended on the reliable operation of complex irrigation systems, public trust in water administrators was essential. If people believed that water was being distributed unfairly or that corruption was undermining the allocation system, the social cooperation necessary for maintaining the canal networks could collapse. The morning's investigation was not just about determining guilt or innocence, it was about preserving the foundation of public confidence that made their civilization possible. As the day wore on, Enlil-Bani realized that the resolution of his case would likely depend not on the facts revealed by his tablets, but on the political calculation of which outcome would best serve the kingdom's interests. If he was found guilty, it would demonstrate that the law applied equally to all citizens and that corruption would not be tolerated. But it would also suggest that the water distribution system was vulnerable to insider manipulation, potentially undermining public confidence. If he was found innocent, it would preserve faith in the administrative system but might appear to excuse the kind of unauthorized water diversions that had actually occurred. The question that would determine his fate, Enlil-Bani began to understand, was not whether he had violated the technical requirements of water distribution law. He almost certainly had. The question was whether his violations served a larger purpose that justified overlooking strict legal compliance, and whether the kingdom's interests were better served by making an example of him or by quietly resolving the matter in a way that preserved the stability of the system he had helped to maintain. The final resolution came not through the formal legal process that Enlil-Bani had feared, but through a demonstration of the very principles that made Babylonian water management so sophisticated and enduring. As the investigation entered its 3rd day, with crowds gathering daily to witness what many expected would be a public execution, the arrival of an unexpected participant transformed the entire proceeding. Hammurabi himself, the great lawgiver whose code had established the legal framework governing water rights throughout the kingdom, appeared at the distribution center accompanied by a small retinue of advisors and the chief engineer responsible for maintaining the region's canal system. The king's presence immediately elevated the water theft case from a local administrative matter to an affair of state, but not in the way that Enlil had expected. Rather than presiding over a formal trial, Hammurabi announced that he would conduct what he called a demonstration of water wisdom, a practical examination of the city's water management system that would reveal the true cause of the recent disruptions and establish new procedures to prevent future problems. The investigation would take the form of a public audit, with all aspects of the water distribution process examined in full view of the citizens, whose survival depended on its proper operation. The demonstration began before dawn on the fourth day, with Hammurabi personally accompanying the water distributors on their rounds. The sight of the king walking through muddy streets, examining canal gates and measuring devices, questioning ordinary workers about their daily routines, created a spectacle that drew hundreds of observers. Here was the most powerful man in the known world literally getting his hands dirty to understand the practical realities of water management. The message was unmistakable. Water distribution was too important to be left to administrators and officials without direct royal oversight. As the royal audit proceeded, it revealed a system that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable than anyone had previously realized. The network of canals, distribution points, and measuring devices represented an engineering achievement that would have impressed the Romans, who would build their aqueducts more than 1,000 years later. But the system's complexity also created numerous opportunities for the kind of quiet manipulation that had led to the current crisis. A gate left open for an extra hour, a measuring vessel that had been subtly modified, a distribution schedule adjusted to favor certain recipients. Any of these apparently minor changes could redirect substantial quantities of water without leaving obvious evidence of theft. The audit also revealed something more troubling. The water theft that had initiated the investigation was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of unauthorized resource allocation that had been developing for months. The defensive wall construction project had been quietly supplementing its water supplies not just through arrangements with individual distributors like Enlil, but through systematic modifications to measuring equipment and distribution schedules throughout the city. The additional water requirements for the construction project had effectively forced the entire water management system to operate beyond its designed capacity, creating shortages that had been absorbed by ordinary citizens who had no way to complain about reduced allocations. But perhaps most significantly, the audit revealed that the water management crisis was itself a symptom of a larger challenge facing Babylonian civilization. The kingdom was growing beyond the capacity of its existing infrastructure to support it. The population increases that represented the success of Hammurabi's reign had created demand for water that exceeded what the current canal system could reliably supply, particularly during dry seasons. The recent theft and distribution irregularities were not evidence of corruption, but desperate attempts to solve an increasingly impossible logistical challenge. Hammurabi's response to these discoveries demonstrated the practical wisdom that made him one of history's most successful rulers. Rather than punishing the individuals who had bent or broken existing rules, he announced a comprehensive reform of the entire water management system. The reforms would include the construction of new canals and storage facilities, the establishment of additional distribution points to reduce crowding and wait times, and the creation of a new administrative structure that would provide better oversight while reducing the temptation for individual corruption. The centerpiece of the reforms was the establishment of what Hammurabi called water councils, local administrative bodies that would include representatives from all major water users in each district. These councils would have the authority to adjust distribution schedules based on seasonal variations and special needs, reducing the pressure on individual distributors to make unauthorized accommodations. The councils would also be responsible for monitoring water quality, maintaining distribution equipment, and resolving disputes between users before they could escalate into legal cases. For Enlil Bani, the reforms represented not punishment, but promotion. His intimate knowledge of the existing system's weaknesses made him an ideal candidate to help implement the new procedures. Rather than facing execution or slavery for water theft, he was appointed to lead one of the new water councils with cool responsibility for training other administrators in the reformed system. His careful record-keeping, which had initially appeared to be evidence of corruption, was recognized as exactly the kind of detailed documentation that would be needed to make the new system work effectively. The resolution of the water theft case also established important legal precedents that would influence water rights law for centuries to come. The principle of adaptive necessity, the idea that strict rule compliance could be set aside when required by changing circumstances, became incorporated into the legal code, but with careful safeguards to prevent abuse. Officials who needed to deviate from standard procedures would be required to document their actions and obtain retroactive approval from appropriate authorities. The reforms recognized that rigid adherence to fixed rules could be as dangerous to community survival as lawless improvisation. The broader lessons of the Babylonian water crisis echoed through subsequent civilizations. The Romans, who built their empire partly on the foundation of sophisticated water management systems, incorporated many Babylonian innovations into their own aqueduct networks. Medieval European cities developed water distribution laws that drew directly on Hammurabi's code. Even modern municipal water systems reflect principles first established in ancient Mesopotamia. The idea that water access is a civic responsibility, that distribution must be regulated to ensure fairness, and that the complexity of water management requires specialized knowledge and administrative structures. But perhaps the most enduring lesson from Enlil Bani's story was the recognition that in any society dependent on shared resources, the tension between individual need and collective survival requires constant negotiation and readjustment. The water theft that had threatened to destroy one man's life ultimately revealed the need for systemic changes that made their entire civilization more resilient. The boring, repetitive work of measuring, distributing, and accounting for water, kind of administrative detail that rarely appears in historical narratives, proved to be the foundation on which human societies are built. The dawn water distribution that had begun as a crisis ended as an opportunity for renewal, establishing patterns of resource management that would endure long after the ziggurats of Babylon had crumbled into dust. In learning to share water fairly, the Babylonians learned to share civilization itself. The bell of Canterbury Cathedral had not yet rung for lauds when Marguerite de Forches rose from her straw pallet in the narrow lute's chamber she shared with 3 other women in the household of Master Geoffrey, the cloth merchant. The darkness before dawn held a particular quality in medieval Canterbury: a thickness. It seemed to muffle sound while somehow amplifying the subtle movements of a city preparing for another day of carefully orchestrated survival. You might imagine that water collection in a substantial medieval town was a simple matter of walking to the nearest well. But in the Canterbury of 1347, the business of fetching water had evolved into a complex social and economic system that governed the daily rhythms of nearly 8,000 souls. Marguerite, whose duties as chief water steward made her responsible for supplying liquid sustenance to Master Geoffrey's household of 23 people, began each day with a series of calculations that would have challenged a modern logistics coordinator. The wool merchants of Canterbury consumed water not just for drinking and cooking, but for the dozens of processes involved in transforming raw fleece into the fine cloth that made the city one of Twin's most prosperous trading centers. Washing wool required enormous quantities of water. Single large fleece might need 50 gallons of water to remove the lanolin. dirt and vegetable matter that accumulated during a sheep's lifetime. Dyeing processes consumed even more, with some colors requiring multiple rinses that could use hundreds of gallons for a single batch of cloth, as water stewardship shaped every aspect of Marguerite's existence. She was, in the language of her time, a water woman, not merely someone who fetched water, but a skilled professional whose expertise in water sources, purification methods, and allocation strategies made her indispensable to the household's operation. Her knowledge included the subtle differences between water drawn from different wells around the city, the seasonal variations that affected water quality, the proper procedures for purifying questionable water, and the complex social protocols that governed access to the best water sources. The pre-dawn routine began with Marguerite examining the previous day's water supplies, stored in a collection of wooden barrels, earthenware crocks, and leather vessels that occupied an entire corner of the merchant's courtyard. Each container served a specific purpose. The oak barrels held water for wool washing, their wood contributing tannins that actually improved the cleaning process. The glazed pottery crocks stored drinking water, their sealed surfaces preventing contamination. The leather vessels, waterproofed with beeswax and pine resin, were reserved for water that would be heated for cooking or washing. As leather could withstand temperature changes that would crack pottery, Marguerite's inspection routine would be familiar to any modern quality control specialist. She examined each container for signs of contamination, the telltale green scum that indicated algae growth, the cloudy appearance that suggested bacterial contamination, the slight off-odor that warned of pollution from animal waste or industrial runoff. Water that failed her inspection would be relegated to non-consuming, uses floor washing, wool rinsing, or disposal. Water that met her standards would be carefully rationed based on the day's anticipated needs and the household's current supplies. The social hierarchy of water access in medieval Canterbury reflected the city's complex economic and political structure. The cathedral, with its extensive community of monks, lay brothers, and ecclesiastical officials, maintained its own sophisticated water system fed by springs outside the city walls. The wealthiest merchants, like Master Geoffrey, had sufficient resources to maintain large water supplies and could afford to send servants to the best sources regardless of distance or cost. Ordinary craftsmen and shopkeepers typically relied on public wells and shared sources, often having to negotiate with neighbors over access rights and maintenance responsibilities. But water stewards like Marguerite occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. Their specialized knowledge made them valuable to multiple households, creating opportunities for a kind of freelance expertise that could provide economic independence, unusual for women in medieval society. A skilled waterwoman might serve several households simultaneously, earning payment in coin, food, or trade goods. The most accomplished water stewards developed reputations that extended throughout the city, making them sought-after employees whose services commanded premium prices. The daily round of water collection began while the city gates were still locked and the streets empty of normal traffic. Marguerite would emerge from Master Geoffrey's house carrying an assortment of collection vessels, wooden buckets for heavy-duty hauling, pottery jugs for drinking water, and leather bags for specialized purposes. Her route through the city was planned with the precision of a military operation, taking advantage of the specific characteristics of different water sources and the varying accessibility of wells and springs throughout the day. Canterbury's water sources each had distinct personalities that determined their suitability for different purposes. The well near the cathedral provided the purest drinking water, filtered through limestone and protected from surface contamination by a stone casing and locked cover. But access to this well was restricted to certain hours and required payment of a small fee to the cathedral authorities. The spring outside the city's eastern gate produced soft water ideal for wool washing and dyeing. But the journey there and back consumed nearly 2 hours and required passing through neighborhoods where a lone woman might face harassment or robbery. The river Stour, which curved around Canterbury's southern edge, provided an unlimited supply of water, but its quality varied dramatically depending on weather, season, and the activities of upstream communities. During dry periods, the river might run clear and sweet. During rainy seasons, it could become muddy and contaminated with runoff from farms and villages. The presence of fulling mills and tanning operations along the riverbank meant that water drawn below these businesses was suitable only for the roughest cleaning tasks. Marguerite's expertise lay not just in knowing where to find water, but in understanding the optimal timing for accessing different sources. The cathedral well, for example, provided the best water early in the morning before the large community of religious had depleted the supply and stirred up sediment. The public wells in the city's market squares offered good access during mid-morning hours when traffic was light, but became crowded and potentially contaminated later in the day as merchants cleaned vegetables and butchers washed meat. The physical demands of water collection would have challenged even the strongest modern athlete. A gallon of water weighs over 8 pounds, and Marguerite routinely carried loads of 4 to 6 gallons per trip. The distances involved could be substantial. Her typical morning circuit covered nearly 3 miles of walking, much of it over uneven cobblestones or muddy streets that made every step treacherous. The collection vessels themselves added weight and awkwardness. A wooden bucket might weigh several pounds even when empty, and pottery vessels required careful handling to prevent breakage that could represent a significant financial loss. But as Marguerite made her way through the pre-dawn streets on this particular morning in late November, she encountered something that filled her with professional alarm. The main public well in the market square, which typically provided reliable water for dozens of households, had been surrounded by a hastily constructed wooden barrier. Posted on the barrier was a notice, written in Latin that few of the city's residents could read, declaring the well temporarily closed by order of the municipal authorities. The reason for the closure was not specified, but the implications were immediately clear. One of Canterbury's primary water sources had become unavailable without warning or explanation. The crisis represented more than mere inconvenience. The closed well served not just individual households, but several of the city's essential businesses: bakers who needed water for bread production, brewers whose product required specific water qualities, and cloth workers whose operations consumed vast quantities of liquid. The sudden loss of this water source would force all of these users to compete for access to alternative supplies, driving up prices and potentially creating shortages that could affect the entire city's economy. For Marguerite personally, the well closure threatened to disrupt the carefully balanced system of water procurement that made her professional reputation possible. Her arrangements with Master Geoffrey's household were based on her ability to provide consistent high-quality water supplies at predictable costs. If she was forced to use more expensive or distant sources, her profit margins would disappear. If she failed to maintain adequate supplies, her position in the household could be terminated, leaving her without income or shelter in the approaching winter. As she stood in the market square, contemplating the closed well and calculating the implications for her daily routine, Marguerite began to realize that the water crisis might represent something more serious than a temporary administrative inconvenience. The timing of the closure, coinciding with reports of illness in several neighborhoods around the city, suggested the possibility of water contamination, a catastrophe that could threaten not just individual livelihoods, but the survival of the entire community. The question that would shape everything that followed was whether Canterbury's elaborate system of water management and social cooperation could adapt quickly enough to prevent a crisis that might claim hundreds of lives before winter's end. The revelation came not through official proclamation, but through the whispered conversations that spread through Canterbury's narrow streets. Like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. By mid-morning of that November day, Marguerite had learned from other water stewards that the well closure was connected to the death of 3 children in the Westgate district, all of whom had sickened with the violent purging and fever that marked waterborne illness. The municipal authorities, acting on advice from the cathedral's infirmary, who served as the city's closest approximation to a medical authority, had ordered the closure of any water source that might have contributed to the contamination. The scope of the crisis became apparent as Marguerite made her rounds to alternative water sources throughout the city. The spring outside the Eastern Gate, normally accessible to anyone willing to make the journey, had been claimed by representatives of the cathedral community who declared it reserved for religious use during the current emergency. The river Stour, always a secondary option due to its variable quality, now showed clear signs of contamination from upstream sources, a thin film of what looked like oil or fat floating on the surface, and an odor that suggested the presence of decaying organic matter. The social dynamics of water access, normally governed by established customs and economic relationships, had dissolved into something approaching chaos. At the remaining public wells, crowds gathered before dawn and remained throughout the day, with arguments breaking out over priority rights and allocation quotas. The prices charged by private well owners for access to their supplies had tripled overnight, putting clean water beyond the reach of ordinary craftsmen and laborers. Most disturbing of all, several households had reported the theft of stored water supplies, barrels and jugs, disappearing from courtyards and storage areas as people became desperate to secure adequate supplies for their families. Marguerite found herself caught between the competing demands of her professional obligations and the growing desperation of the community around her. Master Geoffrey's household, with its substantial resources and established relationships, could afford to pay premium prices for water from private sources. But the cloth merchant's business depended on maintaining good relationships with the workers, suppliers, and customers who formed the broader economic network of Canterbury's textile trade. If the water crisis destroyed the livelihoods of these essential partners, even the wealthiest merchants would ultimately suffer. The technical challenges of maintaining water supplies during the crisis revealed the sophisticated knowledge that professional water stewards had developed over generations of experience. Marguerite's expertise included not just knowing where to find water, but understanding how to purify questionable supplies using methods that had been passed down through networks of women who had faced similar crises in previous generations. The process of water purification in medieval Canterbury involved a combination of techniques that would have impressed modern public health officials. The first stage involved simple filtration through layers of clean sand, charcoal, and cloth that could remove visible particles and some contaminants. Sand filters, constructed in wooden boxes or pottery vessels, could clarify muddy water and reduce certain types of bacterial contamination. Charcoal, prepared by slowly burning specific types of wood in oxygen-starved conditions, could absorb many of the chemicals and organic compounds that caused water to taste or smell unpleasant. Cloth filters, woven from linen or wool and carefully maintained to prevent contamination, provided the final stage of purification before water was considered safe for consumption. But filtration alone was not sufficient for seriously contaminated water. The most dangerous contaminants, the invisible organisms that caused the violent illnesses spreading through Canterbury, required more aggressive treatment. The standard method involved boiling water for extended periods, then allowing it to cool while covered to prevent recontamination. The fuel costs for boiling large quantities of water represented a significant expense, particularly during a crisis when competition for firewood and charcoal had driven prices to extreme levels. Some water stewards employed even more sophisticated techniques that had been developed through centuries of experimentation. Adding specific quantities of salt to boiling water could enhance its purifying effects. though the process required careful measurement to avoid making the water unpalatable. Certain herbs, particularly those with strong antimicrobial properties, could be boiled with water to improve its safety. The most skilled practitioners knew how to use aluma mineral salt obtained from specialized traders to clarify water and reduce certain types of contamination. The economic implications of the water crisis extended far beyond the immediate costs of obtaining alternative supplies. Canterbury's textile industry, which formed the foundation of the city's prosperity, required enormous quantities of water for every stage of cloth production. Wool washing, the first step in the process, consumed between 30 and 50 gallons of water per fleece, depending on the quality of the raw material and the standards required for the finished product. The soaking, rinsing, raising and fulling processes that transformed raw wool into finished cloth required additional hundreds of gallons per batch. The dyeing industry, which added significant value to Canterbury's textile exports, was particularly vulnerable to water shortages. The complex chemical processes involved in creating the rich colors that commanded premium prices in European markets required not just large quantities of water, but water of specific qualities. Hard water, with high mineral content, could interfere with dye absorption and create uneven coloring. Contaminated water could react with expensive imported dyes to create unpredictable results that rendered entire batches of cloth worthless as the water crisis entered its second week. The social fabric of Canterbury began to show signs of dangerous strain. The elaborate systems of cooperation and mutual obligation that normally governed resource distribution were breaking down under the pressure of genuine scarcity. Marguerite witnessed fights breaking out at public wells as people who had waited hours for access found themselves pushed aside by those claiming emergency privileges. The normal deference shown to social superiors dissolved when survival was at stakes. Saw a baker's apprentice refuse to yield his place in line to a merchant's servant, leading to a confrontation that required intervention by the city watch. The crisis also revealed the hidden vulnerabilities in Canterbury's water infrastructure that had developed over decades of gradual expansion and makeshift improvements. Many of the city's wells had been dug generations earlier when the population was smaller and the industrial demands less intensive. The growing number of cloth workshops, tanneries, and other businesses that required water-intensive processes had gradually increased demand beyond what the original water sources could reliably supply. The current crisis was exposing problems that had been building for years but had remained invisible during periods of adequate supply. Marguerite knew from conversations with traveling merchants faced restrictions that prevented them from drawing water at public fountains between sunset and sunrise. But Canterbury had no such regulations, largely because the city's authorities had never anticipated a crisis severe enough to require such measures. The absence of clear rules about emergency water allocation was now creating confusion and conflict that threatened to escalate beyond the ability of local authorities to control. The investigation into the source of contamination revealed the complex interconnections between different aspects of medieval urban life. The illness that had prompted the well closure was eventually traced to a tanning operation upstream from the city, where changes in the leather processing methods had introduced new chemicals into the water supply. The tanners, seeking to improve the quality and speed of their production, had begun using imported materials whose environmental effects they did not fully understand. Their individual business decision had created consequences that affected thousands of people downstream, but the contamination problem was compounded by the city's waste disposal practices, which had remained adequate for a smaller population but were increasingly overwhelmed by Canterbury's growth. Human and animal waste, normally diluted and carried away by the river system, had begun to accumulate in areas where water flow was insufficient to prevent dangerous concentrations of organic matter. The combination of industrial contamination and inadequate waste management had created conditions that made waterborne illness almost inevitable. For Marguerite, The crisis had become personal as well as professional. Her reputation as a skilled water steward was being tested by circumstances beyond her control, but her clients and employers expected her to maintain the same level of service regardless of external challenges. The pressure was complicated by her growing awareness that some of the water sources she had been using might themselves be contaminated, potentially making her complicit in spreading the very illnesses she was trying to help her household avoid. The question that would determine not just her professional future, but the survival of many in Canterbury, was whether the community could organize effective collective action quickly enough to address the crisis before winter weather made water procurement even more difficult and dangerous. The solution, when it came, emerged not from official proclamation or administrative decree, but from the kind of practical cooperation that had sustained medieval communities through countless previous crises. The initiative began with a meeting in the cathedral's chapter house, organized by Brother Thomas, the infirmary whose medical knowledge had identified the source of the contamination. But the participants included not just religious authorities and civic officials, but also the professional water stewards, whose practical expertise would be essential for implementing any effective response. Marguerite found herself seated at a heavy oak table alongside Master Geoffrey and representatives from every major household and business in Canterbury, discussing technical details of water management with the same seriousness that might normally be reserved for matters of war or taxation. The recognition that professional water stewards possessed knowledge essential to the community's survival marked a significant shift in social relationships that would have lasting implications for how medieval society understood the value of women's work. The plan that emerged from these discussions represented a sophisticated approach to crisis management that drew on both traditional knowledge and innovative adaptation to changing circumstances. The community would establish a coordinated water distribution system that would ensure equitable access to safe supplies while maintaining the economic activities essential to the city's survival. The plan required cooperation between competing interests and the temporary suspension of normal market relationships in favor of managed allocation based on community needs. The technical foundation of the plan involved the construction of a centralized water purification facility located near the cathedral, where contaminated water could be processed using the most effective available methods before distribution throughout the city. The facility would employ multiple purification techniques simultaneously: large sand and charcoal filters for basic cleaning, extensive boiling operations for pathogen elimination, and settling tanks where treated water could be stored safely before distribution. The scale of the operation required resources and coordination beyond what any individual household could manage. The social innovation lay in the organization of the system's operation, rather than relying on existing commercial relationships or traditional authority structures. The plan created new forms of collective responsibility that crossed normal social boundaries. Water stewards like Marguerite would work alongside apprentices from cloth workshops, servants from wealthy households, and members of religious communities to operate the purification facility and manage distribution routes. The shared labor would be compensated through a combination of direct payment and allocation credits that ensured fair access to the processed water. The economic arrangements reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain essential activities during resource crises. Businesses that required large quantities of water for their operations would receive priority allocation, but in exchange for commitments to maintain employment and continue essential services to the community. The cloth merchants would continue paying wages to their workers. The bakers would maintain bread production, and the brewers would produce the weak beer that served as a safe alternative to questionable water supplies. The implementation of the plan revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval community organization. The initial stages proceeded smoothly, with voluntary participation exceeding expectations and the technical aspects of water purification working better than anticipated. The centralized facility could process nearly 1,000 gallons of water per day, enough to meet the basic needs of the entire city if carefully managed. The quality of the processed water exceeded what most residents had previously considered normal, demonstrating the effectiveness of systematic purification methods. But the system also exposed tensions and inequalities that had previously remained hidden. Some wealthy households attempted to negotiate private arrangements that would give them preferential access to processed water, threatening the principle of equitable distribution that made the entire system viable. Certain craft workshops complained that their water allocations were insufficient for normal operations, demanding exceptions that would have undermined allocations to domestic users. Most seriously, some members of the community refused to participate in the collective labor required to operate the system, preferring to purchase water from private sources despite the higher costs and uncertain quality. The resolution of these challenges required a level of community self-governance that pushed medieval Canterbury social institutions beyond their normal boundaries. The water crisis had created conditions that demanded new forms of collective decision-making, resource allocation, and dispute resolution. The solutions that emerged would influence the city's social and political development for generations to come. For Marguerite personally, the crisis marked a transformation from individual, professional, to community leader. Her expertise in water management had made her an essential participant in the collective response. But her experience organizing cooperative labor and mediating disputes between different interest groups had revealed leadership capabilities that extended far beyond technical knowledge. By the time the immediate crisis was resolved, she had become a recognized authority whose opinions carried weight in community discussions about resource management and public policy. The long-term consequences of Canterbury's water crisis extended well beyond the immediate resolution of contamination problems. The community had demonstrated that effective collective action was possible even in the face of serious resource shortages, but only through forms of cooperation that required temporary suspension of normal competitive relationships. The experience had revealed both the resilience and the fragility of medieval urban civilization. The centralized water purification system continued to operate even after the immediate crisis had passed, becoming a permanent feature of Canterbury's infrastructure. The cooperative labor arrangements evolved into new forms of civic organization that would influence the city's response to future challenges. Most importantly, the crisis had established the principle that access to clean water was a community responsibility that transcended individual economic circumstances. The boring, repetitive work of fetching, purifying, and distributing water work that was primarily performed by women like Marguerite had proven to be the foundation on which the entire community's survival depended. In learning to organize this work collectively, the people of Canterbury had learned to organize themselves as a community capable of confronting existential challenges through cooperation rather than competition. The dawn water rounds that had begun as individual survival strategies had become the basis for collective resilience that would sustain their civilization through whatever challenges the future might bring. The rooster had not yet announced the dawn when 8-year-old Samuel Worthington felt his father's calloused hand shake his shoulder in the single-room cabin that housed his family of 7 on their homestead claim in what would one day become Nebraska territory. The year was 1847, and the Worthington family had been living on their 106-acre claim for just over 2 years, long enough to learn that survival on the American frontier depended on a daily routine so precisely timed and methodically executed that even the youngest children understood. Their lives might depend on completing their assigned tasks without error or delay. Samuel's first conscious awareness each morning was not of his own comfort or the warmth of the shared sleeping area where his siblings still lay bundled in wool blankets and buffalo robes, but of the water situation that would govern every activity of the day ahead. You might assume that water was readily available to frontier families who had chosen their homestead locations based partly on proximity to reliable sources. But the reality was that nearby was a relative term that might mean a quarter mile. Walk to the creek that gave their settlement its name, and reliable meant water that flowed most of the year but could drop to a muddy trickle during dry summers or freeze solid during the brutal prairie winters. The water collection routine began while the cabin was still dark and would continue intermittently throughout the day, requiring multiple trips that could consume hours of time that the family desperately needed for the countless other tasks essential to frontier survival. Samuel's assignment, shared with his younger sister Mary, who was barely 6 years old, was to make the first water run of each day, carrying wooden buckets to Sunrise Creek and returning with enough water to meet the family's most urgent morning needs: drinking water for the adults, water for preparing cornmeal mush that would serve as breakfast, and water for the essential washing that would prepare them for another day of hard physical labor. The walk to Sunrise Creek required careful navigation through terrain that changed with every season and weather pattern. During spring, the path became a muddy obstacle course where each step might sink ankle-deep into prairie soil softened by snowmelt and rain. Summer brought different challenges. The grass grew tall enough to hide prairie dog holes and snake dens, while the sun's heat made the return journey with heavy water buckets an exhausting ordeal that left the children dizzy and nauseous. Fall presented the deceptive beauty of easier walking conditions that masked the urgency of preparing for winter's brutal restrictions on outdoor activity. But winter was when water collection became a matter of life and death that tested every aspect of the frontier family's survival skills. Sunrise Creek, which flowed freely through most of the year, would develop a layer of ice that could be several inches thick, requiring the children to carry hatchets or iron bars to break through to the flowing water beneath. The ice-breaking process was dangerous work for small hands. A poorly aimed blow could result in serious injury, while breaking through ice in the wrong location could create conditions where a child might fall through and face immediate drowning in water so cold that survival time was measured in minutes. The physical demands of water collection would have challenged adults, let alone children whose bodies were still developing the strength and endurance required for frontier life. Water is heavy. A single gallon weighs over 8 pounds, and the buckets used by frontier families typically held between 2 and 3 gallons when full. Samuel and Mary together might carry 6 gallons of water on each trip, representing nearly 50 pounds of weight that had to be transported across uneven ground, up and down creek banks, and through whatever weather conditions prevailed. The children learned to distribute this weight using techniques that had been developed through generations of frontier experience. Wooden buckets were carried using yokes carved from local timber that stick distributed weight across the shoulders rather than concentrating it in the arms and hands. The yokes required careful adjustment to each child's size and strength to loose, and the buckets would swing dangerously with each step. Too tight, and the pressure could cause painful chafing or restrict breathing during the strenuous return journey. The timing of water collection was governed by factors that extended far beyond the family's convenience or preference. Prairie weather patterns meant that conditions could change rapidly and dramatically, transforming a routine morning task into a dangerous expedition. Samuel had learned to read the subtle signs that warned of approaching storms, the particular quality of light that preceded high winds, the behavior of birds and small animals that indicated pressure changes, the smell of the air that suggested rain or snow was approaching. Winter mornings presented the greatest challenges, requiring the children to begin their water runs while the temperature was still far below freezing and the prairie wind created conditions that could cause frostbite within minutes of exposure. The family's survival depended on maintaining adequate water supplies even under these extreme conditions. But the risks of sending children out in dangerous weather had to be balanced. against the certainty that lack of water would doom the entire family. Samuel's responsibilities extended beyond simply fetching water to include understanding the quality and characteristics of different water sources available to the family. Sunrise Creek itself varied dramatically in quality depending on seasonal conditions, recent weather, and the activities of upstream neighbors whose own survival needs sometimes conflicted with water conservation. During dry periods, the creek might become stagnant and develop the green scum and unpleasant odor that warned of dangerous contamination. During heavy rains, the water could become muddy and filled with debris that made it unsuitable for drinking without extensive settling and filtration. The family had identified several alternative water sources that could be used when Sunrise Creek was unavailable or unsuitable. A natural spring located nearly a mile from the homestead provided the purest water available in the area, but the distance made regular use impractical except during emergencies. Several neighbors had dug wells on their claims, and informal agreements allowed families to share access during crises. But these arrangements required careful maintenance of social relationships that could be complicated by competition for other resources. The children also learned to recognize and utilize natural water sources that might be available temporarily. Rainwater that could be collected from the cabin's roof during storms. Snow that could be melted during winter months. And morning dew that could be gathered from large pieces of cloth spread on the grass during certain weather conditions. These alternative sources required different collection and purification techniques, expanding the children's knowledge of water management beyond the basic routine of creek water collection. But on this particular morning in late October, as Samuel and Mary prepared for their daily water run, they encountered something that immediately changed their understanding of the day ahead. The sound that normally greeted them as they approached Sunrise Creek, the gentle gurgle of water flowing over rocks and around fallen logs, was absent. In its place was an ominous silence that could mean only one thing: the creek had stopped flowing. Either because of an upstream blockage or because the seasonal drop in water levels had finally reached the point where their primary water source was no longer reliable. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the inconvenience of having to find alternative water sources. The family's survival strategy for the approaching winter was based on the assumption that Sunrise Creek would continue to provide water even after freezing conditions made collection more difficult. If the creek had stopped flowing permanently, they would need to find alternative arrangements that might require relocating to a different homestead claim or negotiating access to neighbors' water sources under terms that could affect their family's independence and long-term prospects. As Samuel stood on the creek bank, looking at the muddy depression where flowing water should have been, he realized that the day's routine had suddenly become a test of everything his family had learned about frontier survival, and that the decisions made in the next few hours might determine whether they could remain on the homestead that represented their hope for a better future. The discovery that Sunrise Creek had stopped flowing set in motion a series of decisions and actions that would test every aspect of the Worthington family's frontier survival skills. Samuel's father, Jacob, had faced similar crises during his childhood in Kentucky and understood that the family's response in the next few days would likely determine whether they could remain on their homestead through the winter or would be forced to abandon their claim and seek shelter with neighbors or relatives better situated to weather the drought than the immediate problem was securing enough water to meet the family's basic needs, while developing a longer-term strategy for the winter months ahead. Jacob calculated that the family required approximately 15 gallons of water per day for essential purposes: drinking, cooking, and the minimal washing necessary to prevent illness. This estimate included water for their livestock: 2 oxen, a cow, several pigs, and a flock of chickens whose survival was essential to the family's economic sustainability. The stored water supplies in their cabin, carefully maintained in wooden barrels and pottery crocks, would last approximately 4 days if strictly rationed. The the search for alternative water sources, revealed both the strengths and limitations of the informal cooperation networks that had developed among frontier families in the Sunrise Creek settlement. The nearest neighbor with a functioning well was the Patterson family, whose homestead was located nearly 2 miles away across terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate as autumn weather brought mud, wind, and the first threat of early snow. The Pattersons had agreed to share water access with neighbors during emergencies, but their well's capacity was limited, and they had their own large family to consider. The negotiations with the Pattersons revealed the complex social and economic calculations that governed resource sharing on the frontier. Water sharing was not simply a matter of neighborly cooperation, but a form of mutual insurance that required careful attention to reciprocity and long-term relationships. The Worthingtons would be expected to provide equivalent assistance to the Pattersons when circumstances required it, potentially including labor for harvest work, shared use of equipment, or support during their own family crises. Samuel found his daily routine completely transformed by the water crisis. Instead of a single morning trip to Sunrise Creek, he was now making multiple daily journeys to the Patterson homestead, each requiring nearly 2 hours of walking and carrying loads that pushed his physical capabilities to their limits. The distances involved meant that water collection now consumed most of his daylight hours, leaving little time for the other tasks that were essential to preparing the homestead for winter: gathering fuel, wood, processing harvest crops, and maintaining the buildings and equipment that the family would depend on during the months of harsh stowage weather ahead. The physical demands of the extended water hauling routine began to take a toll on both Samuel and Mary that concerned their parents. The children were losing weight from the additional exertion at a time when building strength for winter should have been a priority. Mary, in particular, was showing signs of exhaustion that worried her mother. Rebecca, who understood that childhood illnesses during frontier winters could easily become fatal in families without access to medical care or adequate nutrition. The technical aspects of transporting water over longer distances required innovations that demonstrated the practical problem-solving skills frontier families developed through necessity. Jacob constructed a larger water-carrying apparatus using materials salvaged from other projects: wagon wheels to create a hand-pulled cart that could transport several times more water than the children could carry in buckets, but which required better paths and more coordinated effort to operate effectively. The cart solution created new challenges while solving others. The improved carrying capacity meant fewer trips were required, reducing the total time spent on water collection. But the cart required 2 people to operate safely, meaning that Samuel and Mary had to work together more closely and could not divide their time between water collection and other tasks. The cart also required more carefully maintained paths between the homesteads, leading to negotiations with the Pattersons about shared responsibility for clearing obstacles and maintaining passage routes as the water crisis extended into its second week. The Worthington family began to confront the possibility that their homestead's location might be fundamentally unsuitable for long-term survival. The failure of Sunrise Creek could indicate broader environmental changes that would make water access increasingly difficult in future years. Climate patterns that frontier families only dimly understood were shifting rainfall distributions in ways that made some previously reliable water sources unreliable. The family's discussions about their long-term prospects revealed the difficult calculations that frontier families faced when their survival strategies were threatened by circumstances beyond their control. Abandoning their homestead claim would mean losing the 2 years of labor they had invested in clearing land, building structures, and establishing crops. But continuing to occupy a homestead without reliable water access could lead to catastrophic consequences during future dry periods. The water crisis also exposed the family to economic pressures that complicated their survival calculations. The additional time required for water collection meant less time available for other productive activities that generated income or reduced expenses. Rebecca had been supplementing the family's resources by taking in washing and mending work for other families in the settlement. But the water shortage made it impossible to continue this work. Jacob's plans to clear additional land for next year's crops had to be postponed while he focused on water procurement and storage. The social dynamics of the settlement were also affected by the water crisis. The increased demand on the Patterson well was creating tensions with other families who had previously relied on it for emergency access. Competition for limited water resources was straining the cooperative relationships that made frontier survival possible, potentially undermining the mutual support networks that all moves stick. Now, all families depended on. But the crisis was also revealing resources and capabilities that had not been fully utilized during normal conditions. Samuel discovered that his sister Mary, despite her young age, had developed observational skills that made her particularly effective at identifying alternative water sources. Her ability to notice subtle differences in vegetation patterns and animal behavior led to the discovery of a seasonal spring that had not been recognized by the adult members of the family. The seasonal spring represented both an opportunity and a challenge. Located approximately halfway between the Worthington and Patterson homesteads, it provided water of excellent quality, but at a flow rate that could only supply a small portion of the family's needs. Accessing the spring required negotiating usage agreements with the Pattersons and potentially other neighbors whose claims bordered the area where the spring was located. As October gave way to November and the first hard frosts warned of winter's approach, the Worthington family faced a decision that would determine not just their immediate survival, but their long-term prospects for establishing a successful homestead on the American frontier. The question was no longer simply how to obtain adequate water supplies, but whether their chosen location could support the kind of permanent settlement they had hoped to create. The resolution of the Worthington family's water crisis came not through a single dramatic discovery, but through the gradual accumulation of knowledge, resources, and relationships that exemplified the way frontier communities adapted to challenges that threatened their survival. The breakthrough began with Samuel's observation that the dried creek bed still showed signs of underground water flow, subtle differences in vegetation and soil moisture that suggested water was still moving through the area. But below the surface, where it was not immediately accessible, Jacob's decision to attempt digging a well in the dried creek bed represented both desperation and frontier pragmatism. Well digging was dangerous, expensive work that required tools and expertise the family did not possess, but the alternative of abandoning their homestead was equally unacceptable. The project would require cooperation from multiple families in the settlement, sharing labor, tools, and the considerable risk that the effort might fail entirely, leaving them worse off than before. The well-digging project became a community undertaking that revealed the sophisticated cooperation networks that made frontier survival possible. The Pattersons contributed a set of specialized digging tools that had been passed down through 2 generations of frontier families. The Henderson family provided technical expertise. The father had worked on well-digging projects during his youth in Ohio and understood the signs that indicated underground water and the techniques for safely excavating narrow, deep holes. In prairie soil, Samuel's role in the well-digging project expanded far beyond his usual water-carrying duties. The excavation required constant removal of dirt and debris from the deepening hole, work that was ideally suited to children who could fit in the narrow space and whose lighter weight made them less likely to destabilize the earthen walls. But the work was also dangerous. Cave-ins could trap or kill workers within seconds, and the increasing depth created risks of poisonous gas accumulation and oxygen depletion that required constant vigilance. The technical challenges of frontier well digging would have impressed professional excavators. Without power tools or sophisticated measuring equipment, the diggers had to rely on traditional techniques for determining the direction and depth of underground water sources. These techniques included following the root patterns of water-loving plants, observing the behavior of insects and small animals that were attracted to moisture, and understanding the geological formations that indicated the likely presence of groundwater. The excavation process revealed layers of prairie geology that told the story of thousands of years of environmental change. The top layer consisted of rich, dark soil that had been built up by centuries of prairie grass growth and decomposition. Below that was a layer of clay that had been deposited during ancient flood periods, followed by sand and gravel that indicated the presence of old stream beds. The deepest layer, where they hoped to find water, consisted of rock formations that could hold and channel underground water flow, as the well reached a depth of nearly 20 feet. The diggers encountered their first sign of success: soil that was noticeably moist and had the distinctive smell that indicated the presence of groundwater. But reaching water was only the first challenge. The well also needed to be lined with stones to prevent cave-ins and contaminated to ensure that the water would remain clean and safe for consumption. The stone lining process required carefully fitted rocks that could support the weight of the earth above while allowing water to seep through from the surrounding soil. The discovery of water at 24 feet below the surface created celebration throughout the settlement, but also marked the beginning of a new phase of challenges. The well's initial flow rate was modest, perhaps 10 gallons per hour during peak production, enough to meet the Worthington family's basic needs, but insufficient for the kind of abundant water supply that would support expanded agricultural activities or provide security during future dry periods. The management of the new well required establishing protocols that would ensure its long-term productivity, while meeting the immediate needs of multiple families who had contributed to its construction. The families agreed to a sharing arrangement that allocated water access based on the labor and materials each had contributed to the project, but with provisions for emergency access that prioritized survival needs over strict economic calculations. Samuel's daily routine was transformed once again, but in ways that reflected greater security and efficiency than the family had previously experienced. The well was located only a few hundred yards from their cabin, reducing water collection time from hours to minutes and eliminating the exhausting long-distance hauling that had consumed so much of his energy. The reliable water source also enabled the family to expand their survival preparations for winter, including increased food preservation activities that required substantial water supplies. The success of the well-digging project had implications that extended far beyond the immediate water supply. The cooperative effort had strengthened relationships between families in the settlement, creating mutual obligations and shared knowledge that would benefit the entire community during future crises. The technical expertise developed during the project would be available for similar efforts on other homesteads, potentially transforming the entire area's capacity for supporting permanent settlement. But perhaps most importantly, the water crisis had demonstrated the frontier principle that survival depended not on individual self-sufficiency, but on the ability to organize collective responses to challenges that exceeded any single family's resources. The boring, exhausting work of digging through 24 feet of prairie soil had required sustained cooperation and mutual support that created social bonds as valuable as the water source itself. For Samuel personally, the experience had accelerated his transition from childhood dependence to adult responsibility in ways that would shape his entire approach to frontier life. His contributions to the family's survival during the water crisis had demonstrated capabilities that earned him recognition as a reliable partner in the essential work of homestead management. The knowledge he had gained about water sources, conservation techniques, and community cooperation would serve him throughout his life as he eventually established his own homestead and family. The winter that followed was harsh, deserts with temperatures that dropped far below zero and snow that accumulated to unprecedented depths. But the reliable water source provided by the community well gave the settlement families the security they needed to weather the extreme conditions. The children who had learned to fetch water before sunrise during the crisis now had the knowledge and skills to maintain their families. Water supplies under any conditions the prairie might impose. The story of Sunrise Creek had become a story of human adaptation and cooperation, demonstrating that frontier survival depended not on conquering nature, but on learning to work within natural constraints through innovation, cooperation, and the boring, essential work of maintaining the systems that made civilized life possible. Even in the most challenging environments, the dawn water runs that had begun as a simple childhood chore had become the foundation for a community's survival and growth, establishing patterns of mutual support and resource management that would sustain frontier settlement for generations to come. The mill whistle had not yet sounded its first call when Margaret O'Brien felt her way through the darkness of the tenement room she shared with 11 other souls, carefully stepping over sleeping bodies as she made her way toward the single window that faced the narrow alley behind Blackwood's cotton mill. The year was 1843, and the industrial city of Manchester had grown so rapidly that its infrastructure lagged far behind the demands of the 60,000 workers who had crowded into hastily constructed housing to serve the textile factories that were transforming England from an agricultural society into the world's first industrial nation. Margaret's day began not with thoughts of her own comfort or the breakfast she could not afford, but with the calculations that governed every aspect of working class survival in industrial England: how much water the household would need for the day ahead, where that water might be obtained, and whether the family's meager resources could stretch to cover both water access and the other necessities that kept them alive from week to week. You might assume that water would be readily available in a modern industrial city, but meant that most working-class homes were built without running water or sanitation, forcing residents to rely on public wells, private vendors, and sources of questionable quality and uncertain availability. The tenement building where Margaret lived housed 43 people in 8 rooms, with entire families crowded into spaces that would barely accommodate a single person by modern standards. The building had no water supply of its own, no pipes, no taps, no internal plumbing of any kind. Every drop of water used by the residents had to be carried in from external sources and stored in whatever containers the families could afford to purchase or improvise. The logistics of supplying water to so many people in such confined quarters required a level of organization and cooperation that tested the limits of human ingenuity and social cohesion. Margaret's role as the primary water steward for her extended household, which included her own family of 5, 2 Irish families who had recently arrived seeking factory work, and several single men who rented sleeping space in corners and hallways, made her one of the most important people in the building's survival system. Her knowledge of water sources throughout Manchester, her understanding of the quality and pricing of different suppliers, and her ability to organize the complex logistics of water procurement and storage had made her indispensable to people who might otherwise have competed with each other for scarce resources. The water procurement process began while the city was still dark and would continue intermittently throughout Margaret's 18-hour workday at the cotton mill. The timing was crucial because the best water sources, those that provided the cleanest water at the most affordable prices, were only available during specific hours and often had limited capacity that could be quickly exhausted by high demand. Missing the optimal timing for water collection could mean paying premium prices for inferior water or going without adequate supplies entirely. Manchester's water sources in 1843 reflected the chaotic, unplanned growth that characterized early industrial development. The River Irwell, which curved through the city center, had once provided clear, fresh water suitable for all purposes. But decades of industrial development had transformed it into an open sewer that carried the waste products of dozens of textile mills, chemical works, and other manufacturing operations. The river water was now so contaminated that it was considered unsuitable even for industrial use, let alone human consumption. The public wells that had served Manchester's residents for generations were increasingly affected by the same industrial contamination that had ruined the river water. Wells located near manufacturing areas often produced water that was discolored, had a chemical taste, or carried odors that warned of dangerous pollution. Even wells in residential areas were becoming unreliable as the rapidly growing population overwhelmed the natural groundwater systems that had previously provided adequate supplies. Private water vendors filled some of the gap left by declining public sources, but their services came at prices that consumed a significant portion of working-class incomes. A gallon of clean water from a reputable vendor might cost the equivalent of an hour's wages for a mill worker, making adequate water supplies a luxury that many families could not afford. The cheapest water vendors often sold supplies of questionable quality from sources they would not reveal, creating health risks that desperate families had little choice but to accept the millware. Margaret worked exemplified the industrial system's disregard for workers' basic needs. Blackwood's cotton mill employed over 800 people in a building that had no provisions for supplying drinking water to the workforce. Workers were expected to bring their own water or purchase it from vendors who set up outside the factory gates, charging premium prices to people who had no alternative options during their 14-hour shifts. The factory's own water supplies, used for steam power and cleaning machinery, were drawn directly from the contaminated River Irwell and were explicitly forbidden for human consumption. Margaret's morning water run began in darkness because that was when she could access the one reliable source of clean water available to working class families in her neighborhood, a private well owned by a middle-class family who allowed limited access to their supply in exchange for payment and strict adherence to scheduling restrictions. The well owner, Mrs. Harrison, permitted working-class families to draw water between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, before her own household began their daily routines and after the overnight settling period that helped clarify the water. The journey to Mrs. Harrison's well required walking nearly a mile through streets that were treacherous in darkness and increasingly dangerous as industrial development had eliminated many of the lighting and paving improvements that made urban navigation safe. The narrow alleys between tenement buildings were often blocked by industrial waste, household garbage, and construction materials from ongoing factory expansion projects. The main streets were crowded with early morning traffic as workers made their way to mill jobs, creating conditions where pedestrians carrying water vessels faced significant risks of accident or theft. Margaret carried her water collection equipment with the efficiency of someone whose survival depended on maximizing every aspect of the procurement process. Her primary vessel was a large earthenware jug that could hold nearly 4 gallons of water, enough to meet her household's most essential needs for drinking and food preparation. The jug was wrapped in cloth padding to prevent breakage and equipped with a cloth cover to reduce contamination during transport. She also carried several smaller containers that could be used for specialized purposes or to take advantage of opportunities to obtain water from multiple sources during a single trip. The water collection process at Mrs. Harrison's well was governed by strict protocols designed to prevent contamination and ensure equitable access among the working-class families who depended on this source. Each family was limited to 4 gallons per day, measured using standardized vessels that Mrs. Harrison provided. The water had to be drawn using the well owner's equipment to prevent contamination from containers that might have been used for other purposes. Payment was required in advance, and families who failed to follow the established procedures could be permanently banned from access. But on this particular morning in November, as Margaret approached Mrs. Harrison's property in the pre-dawn darkness, She encountered a sight that filled her with immediate dread. A handwritten notice had been posted on the gate that normally provided access to the well, and even in the dim light of her oil lamp, she could read the words that would transform her household's survival situation. Well closed by order of Municipal Health Authority. Water supply contaminated. No access until further notice. The implications of this development extended far beyond the inconvenience of finding alternative water sources. Mrs. Harrison's well had served over 30 working-class families in the immediate neighborhood, representing nearly 200 people whose daily survival depended on access to clean water at affordable prices. The sudden closure meant that all of these families would be competing for access to the remaining water sources in the area, driving up prices and potentially creating shortages that could lead to dehydration, illness, or worse. Margaret stood in the darkness, reading and rereading the notice by lamplight, as other families arrived for their usual morning water collection and discovered the same devastating news. The conversations that began in whispers quickly escalated to arguments as people realized the scope of the crisis they were facing. Some families had no alternative water sources identified and were facing the immediate prospect of having no water supplies for their children's breakfast or their own needs during the long factory shifts ahead. The social dynamics of the situation revealed the complex relationships that governed working-class survival in industrial Manchester. The families who had been sharing access to Mrs. Harrison's well were not simply neighbors. They were part of an intricate network of mutual obligations and shared resources that made survival possible on wages that were barely adequate for individual families. The water crisis threatened to disrupt these cooperative relationships as families were forced to compete for access to scarce alternatives. Margaret's position as an experienced water steward made her both a valuable resource and a target for desperate families seeking guidance. Her knowledge of Manchester's water sources, accumulated over years of daily procurement activities, represented information that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for families with no other options. But sharing this information could also mean reducing her own family's access to alternative sources that might already be operating at capacity. The immediate crisis was compounded by the timing of the well closure. The approaching winter meant that water collection would become increasingly difficult as weather conditions deteriorated. The longer distances to alternative sources would become more dangerous as ice and snow made Manchester's poorly maintained streets treacherous for people carrying heavy water containers. The increased physical demands of water procurement would affect families that were already struggling with malnutrition and the health effects of industrial working conditions. As Margaret made her way back to the tenement building to inform her household of the crisis, she began to realize that the water shortage was likely to become a test of everything the working-class community had learned about survival in industrial England. The boring, repetitive work of fetching water before dawn work that was essential but rarely acknowledged had suddenly become a matter of life and death that would determine which families could remain in Manchester and which would be forced to seek survival elsewhere. The search for alternative water sources revealed the full extent of industrial Manchester's environmental degradation and the desperate measures that working-class families were forced to adopt when their survival was threatened. Margaret's investigation of potential replacement sources for Mrs. Harrison's well took her into parts of the city she had previously avoided, areas where the concentration of chemical works and textile mills had created conditions that would have horrified even the most hardened social reformers of the era. The closest alternative source was a public well located near the city center, approximately 2 miles from Margaret's tenement building. The well had once served a prosperous residential neighborhood, but industrial development had transformed the surrounding area into a maze of factories, warehouses, and worker housing that had overwhelmed the well's capacity and compromised its water quality. The well now served over 300 families during peak demand periods. creating lines that could extend for blocks and wait times that consumed entire mornings. Margaret's first visit to the central well revealed conditions that exemplified the public health crisis that industrial development had created throughout working-class Manchester. The well structure itself was deteriorating. The stone casing had cracked, allowing surface contamination to seep into the groundwater supply. The area around the well was contaminated with industrial runoff, household waste, and animal excrement that created a permanent odor and attracted swarms of flies even in cold weather. The water drawn from the well had a distinctly chemical taste and a slight discoloration that suggested the presence of real pollutants. The social dynamics around the public well reflected the desperation that drove working-class families to accept conditions that they knew were dangerous to their health. Families with sick children were given priority access, but determining who qualified for such priority often led to arguments and occasionally violence. Women who were visibly pregnant received preference, but this created resentment from families with multiple children whose needs were equally urgent. The informal rationing system that had developed around the well was constantly threatened by the arrival of new families seeking access as other water sources became unavailable. The water vendors who operated near the factory gates represented another potential source. But their prices had increased dramatically as demand grew and competition for clean water intensified. A gallon of water that had previously cost the equivalent of 1 hour's wages now commanded prices equal to 3 or 4 hours of millwork. For families already struggling to afford basic food and shelter, such prices made adequate water consumption an impossible luxury that forced them to choose between hydration and other essential needs. Margaret's exploration of vendor options revealed the predatory practices that had developed around working-class desperation. Some vendors were diluting their water supplies with river water to increase profits, creating health risks while charging premium prices. Others were selling water of unknown origin, often drawn from sources that were potentially more contaminated than the public wells they were supposedly replacing. The most unscrupulous vendors were taking advantage of customers' limited ability to assess water quality, selling supplies that were clearly contaminated to families who had no other options. The crisis also exposed Margaret to water sources that desperate families were using despite obvious health risks. The River Irwell, officially declared unfit for human consumption, was still being used by some families who boiled the water extensively in hopes of making it safe. Industrial runoff channels that carried waste from chemical works were being tapped by people who had convinced themselves that the chemicals might actually purify the water. Even stagnant pools that collected rainwater in industrial areas were being used by families who had exhausted all other alternatives. The health consequences of the water crisis began to appear within days of Mrs. Harrison's well closure. Margaret observed symptoms among her tenement neighbors that she recognized as signs of waterborne illness. The violent digestive problems that indicated bacterial contamination, the gradual weakness that suggested chronic dehydration, and the skin conditions that developed when families reduced washing to conserve their limited water supplies for drinking and cooking. The children in the building were particularly affected by the water shortage. Their smaller body size made them more vulnerable to dehydration, while their developing immune systems were less capable of fighting off the infections that contaminated water supplies could introduce. Margaret watched young children becoming listless and irritable as their families struggled to provide adequate fluid intake, and she knew that the approaching winter would make the situation even more dangerous. The impact on working-class women was particularly severe because they bore primary responsibility for managing household water supplies while also working full-time in the mills. Margaret found herself spending hours each day in water procurement. Activities that had previously taken less than an hour, time that had to be stolen from sleep, meals, or the minimal rest periods that were essential for surviving the physical demands of industrial work. The additional walking involved in reaching distant water sources was exhausting workers who were already pushed to the limits of their physical capabilities. The mill owners' response to the water crisis revealed the callous disregard for worker welfare that characterized early industrial capitalism. Rather than providing water supplies for their employees, factory management simply posted notices warning workers that they would be fined for missing work due to illness, regardless of the cause. The mills continued to draw unlimited quantities of water from contaminated sources for their machinery, while forbidding workers to access even these industrial supplies for drinking purposes. The municipal authorities' handling of the crisis demonstrated the political powerlessness of working-class families in industrial England. The health inspectors who had closed Mrs. Harrison's well provided no information about alternative sources or assistance for the families who depended on the contaminated supply. The city council, dominated by mill owners and middle-class merchants, refused to consider public investment in water infrastructure that would serve working-class neighborhoods. The police were deployed to prevent disorder around the remaining water sources. But no resources were allocated to address the underlying crisis that was creating desperation. As the water shortage entered its second week, Margaret began to understand that the crisis was not simply a temporary inconvenience that would be resolved through individual adaptation and community cooperation. The water problems were symptoms of a larger systemic failure that had prioritized industrial profit over human survival, creating conditions where working-class families were expendable casualties in the pursuit of economic growth. The question facing Margaret and her neighbors was whether they could organize collective responses that would force the authorities to address their needs, or whether they would be left to face the approaching winter with inadequate water supplies and no prospect of improvement. The resolution of Manchester's working class water crisis emerged not from official intervention or market solutions, but from the kind of collective action that would later influence the development of labor organizing and social reform movements throughout industrial Britain. The initiative began with a meeting in the basement of St. Patrick's Church, organized by Father Michael O'Connor, whose Irish congregation included many of the families affected by the closure of Mrs. Harrison's well. But the participants quickly expanded beyond religious boundaries to include workers from multiple ethnic communities and various trades who recognized that the water crisis threatened the entire working class population of industrial Manchester. Margaret found herself serving as one of the primary organizers of what became known as the Water Committee, a group that combined practical expertise in water procurement with the political understanding that individual families could not solve problems created by systemic failures in industrial society. The committee's initial meetings revealed both the scope of the crisis and the potential for collective action that could address problems too large for individual families to handle alone. The committee's first major discovery was that the water crisis extended far beyond the families who had been served by Mrs. Harrison's well. Municipal health inspectors, responding to increasing reports of waterborne illness, had quietly closed or restricted access to over a dozen water sources throughout working-class neighborhoods. The closures had been implemented without public notice or consultation with affected communities, leaving thousands of families scrambling for alternative supplies while official authorities denied that any systematic problem existed. The investigation also revealed that Manchester's industrial development had systematically destroyed or contaminated virtually every natural water source within reasonable distance of working-class housing. The River Irwell and its tributaries were so polluted that even industrial uses were becoming problematic. Groundwater supplies had been contaminated by industrial waste disposal practices that had continued for decades without regulation or oversight. Even rainwater collection was becoming difficult as atmospheric pollution from factory smokestacks created chemical contamination that made precipitation unsafe for human consumption. The Water Committee's response combined immediate, practical assistance with longer-term organizing for systematic change. The immediate response involved establishing a cooperative water procurement system that could provide clean water to affected families at affordable prices. The committee negotiated bulk purchasing agreements with reputable water vendors, reducing per-gallon costs through volume discounts. They organized shared transportation that could deliver water directly to tenement buildings, eliminating the time and physical burden of individual collection trips. The cooperative system required contributions of labor and modest financial resources from participating families, but it was structured to ensure that families in crisis situations would not be denied access to water due to temporary inability to pay. Members who were ill, unemployed, or facing family emergencies could receive water supplies on credit that would be repaid when circumstances improved. The system also included provisions for elderly residents and families with multiple young children who faced special challenges in water procurement. But the committee's most innovative response was the decision to establish their own water source through collective action that challenged the property rights and political structures that had created the crisis. The committee identified a location on the outskirts of Manchester where natural spring water was still available, but which was owned by a merchant who had refused to allow working-class access to the supply. Rather than accepting this exclusion, the committee organized what they called a water reclamation project that would establish community rights to essential resources. The water reclamation project involved several hundred working-class families in a coordinated campaign that combined legal challenges, direct action, and political pressure. The legal component involved documenting the historical use of the spring by local residents and challenging the merchant's exclusive ownership claims. The direct action component involved organized groups of families who would travel to the spring to collect water, deliberately violating the merchant's prohibitions in order to force legal and political authorities to address the broader crisis. The political pressure campaign involved petitioning local authorities, organizing public meetings, and building alliances with middle-class reformers who were beginning to recognize that industrial development had created public health crises that threatened the entire urban population. The committee's members spoke at city council meetings, wrote letters to newspapers, and organized demonstrations that brought public attention to conditions that official authorities had preferred to ignore. Margaret's role in the water reclamation project demonstrated the leadership capabilities that working-class women had developed through years of managing household survival under impossible conditions. Her detailed knowledge of water sources, quality assessment, and procurement logistics made her an essential technical advisor for the committee's operations. But her experience in organizing cooperation among competing families and interest groups proved equally valuable for the political aspects of the campaign. The success of the water reclamation project came through a combination of persistence, strategic thinking, and the growing recognition that working-class families represented a political force that could not be entirely ignored. The merchant who owned the spring, faced with continuous disruption of his property and negative publicity about his role in the water crisis, eventually agreed to sell access rights to the community at a price that the committee could afford. Through collective contributions, the establishment of community-controlled water access represented more than just a solution to immediate survival needs. It demonstrated that working-class families could organize effective collective action that challenged the property rights and political structures that had created their problems. The Water Committee became a model for other organizing efforts that addressed housing conditions, workplace safety, and wage issues that affected Manchester's industrial workers. The long-term consequences of the water crisis and the community response extended far beyond the immediate resolution of supply problems. The organizing experience had created networks of cooperation and mutual support that would sustain working-class communities through future crises. The political lessons learned during the water campaign would influence labor organizing efforts that eventually led to significant improvements in working conditions and living standards. For Margaret personally, the crisis had transformed her from an individual struggling for family survival into a community leader whose expertise and organizing abilities were recognized throughout Manchester's working-class neighborhoods. Her knowledge of water management had become the foundation for broader understanding of how communities could organize collective responses to systemic problems that exceeded individual capabilities. The dawn water runs that had begun as desperate individual attempts to secure basic survival needs had evolved into a foundation for collective action that challenged the fundamental assumptions of industrial capitalism. The boring, repetitive work of fetching water before sunrise had revealed the potential for working-class solidarity and political action that would eventually transform British society. The water crisis had demonstrated that survival in industrial society required not just individual adaptation to impossible conditions, but collective action that could force systemic changes in how resources were distributed and controlled. The lessons learned during Manchester's water crisis would influence social reform movements, labor organizing, and public health policy for generations to come. The children who had learned to fetch water in darkness during the crisis grew up understanding that their survival depended not on individual effort alone, but on their ability to work together to address challenges that threatened their entire community. The water that had been secured through collective action became a symbol of what working-class families could achieve when they recognized their shared interests and organized to defend them. The story of the mill workers' dark well had become a story of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change when survival demanded it, establishing patterns of cooperation and resistance that would sustain working-class communities through the long struggle for social justice and economic equality that would define the next century of British history. As we emerge from these 4 chronicles of water and survival, spanning over 3 millennia of human civilization, we find ourselves confronting a profound truth that connects the shadow-bound water distributors of ancient Babylon to the mill workers of industrial Manchester. The act of fetching water before sunrise has always been about more than simple procurement of a necessary resource. It has been about the fundamental human capacity to organize survival in the face of scarcity, to create cooperation where competition might seem more natural, and to transform the most mundane aspects of daily existence into the foundation stones of civilization itself. The boring history of pre-dawn water collection reveals patterns that echo through every human society that has ever faced the challenge of sustaining life in conditions where essential resources could not be taken for granted. From Manella Bani's careful calculations in the canal networks of Mesopotamia to Margaret O'Brien's desperate search for clean water in the industrial wasteland of Manchester, we see the same fundamental dynamic. Survival depends not on individual heroism or dramatic innovation, but on the patient, repetitive work of maintaining the systems that make collective life possible. The children who learn to carry water in darkness, Samuel navigating the frozen paths to Sunrise Creek, young Mary trudging through Canterbury's narrow streets, the countless unnamed children whose labor supported the water stewards of medieval Europe. These figures remind us that civilization has always depended on the willingness of ordinary people to accept extraordinary responsibility for the welfare of their communities. The physical demands of water collection, the social negotiations required for sharing scarce resources, the technical knowledge needed to identify and purify questionable supplies, all of these mundane skills represented forms of expertise that were as essential to human survival as the military strategies and political innovations that typically dominate historical narratives. Perhaps most remarkably, each of these water crises revealed the capacity of human communities to adapt and innovate under pressure, creating new forms of cooperation and resource management that outlasted the immediate challenges that prompted their development. Hammurabi's water councils established principles of resource allocation that influenced legal systems for centuries, the cooperative networks that emerged from Canterbury's contamination crisis provided models for medieval urban organization that spread throughout Europe. The frontier well-digging projects of the American West created patterns of community cooperation that shaped the development of democratic institutions in agricultural societies. The water committees of industrial Manchester pioneered forms of working-class organization that would eventually transform the relationship between labor and capital throughout the industrial world. But these stories also reveal the fragility of the systems on which human survival depends. The contamination of a single well could threaten the lives of thousands of people. The failure of seasonal water sources could force entire communities to abandon homesteads that represented years of labor and investment. The closure of urban water supplies could create health crises that revealed the brutal inequalities of industrial society. The boring work of maintaining water access required constant vigilance and cooperation, because the collapse of these systems could lead to catastrophic consequences within days or weeks. The modern reader, accustomed to turning a tap and expecting clean water to flow without limit, might find it difficult to comprehend the calculations that governed every aspect of daily life for the people in these stories. But the fundamental challenges they faced, the need to balance individual survival with collective welfare, the requirement to maintain complex systems of cooperation under conditions of scarcity, the necessity of adapting to environmental changes that threatened established ways of life. These challenges have not disappeared from human experience. They have simply been transferred to different scales and contexts. The climate crises of the 21st century, the urban water shortages that affect billions of people in developing nations, the infrastructure failures that periodically disrupt water supplies even in the wealthiest societies. All of these contemporary challenges require the same kinds of cooperative problem-solving and adaptive innovation that sustained human communities throughout the historical periods we have examined. The boring work of maintaining water systems, organizing equitable distribution, and developing sustainable sources remains as essential to human survival as it was in ancient Babylon or medieval Canterbury. The pre-dawn water runs that structured daily life for countless generations of human beings represent something more than historical curiosity. They represent a form of knowledge about cooperation, adaptation, and survival that may be essential for navigating the challenges that face contemporary civilization. The people who learned to organize their lives around the rhythms of water procurement understood that survival was a collective enterprise that required constant attention to the mundane details of resource management and social cooperation. The dawn that broke over in Lil Bonnie's canal networks, over Marguerite's medieval streets, over Samuel's prairie homestead, and over Margaret's industrial city was the same dawn that breaks over our contemporary world each morning. The light reveals the same fundamental human challenge: how to organize collective survival in a world where essential resources are never guaranteed and where the systems that sustain life require constant maintenance and adaptation. The brutal truth about fetching water before sunrise is that it was never really about the water. It was about learning to be human in a world that demands both individual responsibility and collective cooperation, both practical skill and adaptive innovation. The boring history of these daily routines contains lessons about resilience, community, and survival that remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The children who rose before dawn to carry water for their families were not just performing a necessary chore. They were learning the skills and developing the understanding that would enable them to maintain civilization itself. Their patient, repetitive work created the foundation on which all subsequent human achievement would be built. The dawn they greeted each morning was not just the beginning of another day, but the continuation of humanity's longest and most important project: learning to live together on a planet where survival depends on our ability to share the resources that sustain us all.